You are lying in a cold stone chamber. The year is 1387, and the marriage bed beside you might as well be a battlefield. The rushes scattered across the floor crackle beneath your feet as you approach what should be the most intimate space in your home. But in medieval times, the bedroom was governed by rules so bizarre, so invasive, and so utterly destructive that they turned the sacred act of marriage into a nightmare of public scrutiny, religious terror, and social humiliation. Tonight, you're about to discover why more medieval marriages were destroyed in the bedroom than on any actual battlefield, and the truth will make your skin crawl. Before diving into these forgotten stories of matrimonial horror, if you enjoy learning about the dark truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these twisted tales together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with humanity's strangest customs. The medieval bedroom wasn't just a private space between husband and wife. It was a stage where the church, the state, and society itself performed their most invasive acts of control. Every aspect of marital intimacy was regulated, monitored, and judged according to rules that would horrify us today. These weren't suggestions or guidelines. These were laws backed by excommunication, public shaming, and in some cases, death itself. The first rule that destroyed medieval marriages was the doctrine of conjugal debt, a twisted interpretation of Christian marriage that turned love into legal obligation. According to church law, neither spouse could refuse the other's sexual demands without committing a mortal sin. This wasn't about mutual desire or affection. This was about duty, performed like any other chore, regardless of illness, pregnancy, exhaustion, or simple human preference. Imagine being told that your body belonged not to yourself, but to your spouse, and that any refusal was tantamount to theft. Women who denied their husbands could be publicly accused of failing in their Christian duty. Men who couldn't perform their conjugal obligations faced humiliation and questions about their very manhood. The bedroom became a prison where consent was irrelevant and desire was replaced by religious compulsion. But the conjugal debt was just the beginning. Medieval theologians had developed an elaborate calendar of forbidden times, when even married couples could not touch each other. These restrictions weren't based on health or practical concerns. They were rooted in the church's deep suspicion of physical pleasure itself. Sundays were completely off limits because they were holy days. Wednesdays and Fridays were forbidden because they were fasting days. Saturdays were banned in preparation for Sunday worship. During Lent, the 40 days before Easter, married couples were expected to live like celibate monks and nuns. The same applied to Advent, the weeks before Christmas. Add in the feast days of various saints, and medieval couples were left with perhaps 90 days a year when marital relations were actually permitted by the church. The consequences of violating these temporal restrictions were severe. Couples caught being intimate on forbidden days could face public penance, where they would be forced to stand outside the church in rough clothing, confessing their sins to the entire community. Children conceived during forbidden times were considered spiritually contaminated, marked by their parents' transgression before they even drew breath. The church's calendar of sexual prohibition created a bizarre rhythm of married life, where couples had to consult religious authorities before expressing physical affection. Imagine the psychological torture of being told that your natural desires were sinful, depending on which day of the week it happened to be. This wasn't guidance. It was systematic destruction of intimate bonds between spouses. Medieval authorities didn't stop at regulating when couples could be intimate. They also dictated exactly how such intimacy could occur. The church taught that there was only one acceptable position for married relations. Anything else was considered sodomy, a sin punishable by severe penance or even death. This wasn't about morality in any recognizable sense. It was about control over the most private moments of human experience. But perhaps the most destructive bedroom rule was the concept of ritual purity, borrowed from Old Testament law and twisted into a weapon against medieval women. According to church doctrine, women were considered unclean during menstruation and for weeks after childbirth. During these periods, they couldn't enter churches, touch holy objects, or even prepare food for their families. In the bedroom, they became untouchable, literally quarantined from their own husbands. This ritual impurity extended far beyond physical separation. Women who violated these restrictions were believed to contaminate everything around them. Food they touched would spoil, crops they walked through would fail, and any intimate contact with their husbands would result in spiritual pollution for both parties. The medieval bedroom became a space of constant anxiety, where women had to track their own bodies like potential sources of contamination. The enforcement of these purity rules created a cycle of shame and isolation that destroyed marriages from within. Husbands were taught to fear their wives' natural bodily functions as sources of spiritual danger. Wives learned to hate their own bodies as obstacles to their relationships with both God and their spouses. The bedroom, which should have been a sanctuary of love and trust, became a minefield of religious terror. Medieval society also imposed the horrifying practice of bedding ceremonies, where the most private moment of a marriage became a public spectacle. On wedding nights, family members, friends, and sometimes even local clergy would escort the newlyweds to their chamber, inspect the bed linens, and in some cases, remain nearby to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. The concept of privacy didn't exist when it came to proving that a marriage had been legally and physically completed. These bedding ceremonies weren't limited to nobility or special occasions. They were common practice across all social classes. Imagine beginning your married life under the scrutiny of relatives and neighbors, knowing that your most intimate moments would be subject to inspection and judgment. The psychological damage inflicted by these customs is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern perspective. The Church's obsession with controlling bedroom behavior extended to the bizarre practice of spiritual examination, where priests would interrogate married couples about their private lives during confession. These weren't general questions about marital harmony. They were detailed inquiries about specific acts, positions, frequencies, and even thoughts during intimate moments. Couples were forced to reveal their most private experiences to religious authorities, who used this information to determine their spiritual worthiness. The interrogation process was methodical and humiliating. Priests armed with detailed manuals would probe into every aspect of marital intimacy, asking questions that would make a modern therapist blush. Did you experience pleasure during the act? Did you think impure thoughts? Did you perform your duties willingly or with reluctance? These weren't counseling sessions designed to help troubled marriages. They were spiritual inquisitions that treated natural human sexuality as inherently suspicious. The manuals used by medieval confessors read like torture devices made of words. They contained hundreds of specific scenarios, each designed to trap couples in admissions of spiritual failure. A wife who admitted to enjoying intimate relations with her husband could be accused of lust, a mortal sin. A husband who confessed to feeling desire for his own wife faced accusations of treating her as an object rather than a spiritual partner. There was no safe answer, no way to navigate these interrogations without spiritual contamination. These confessional practices created a culture of sexual paranoia that poisoned marriages from within. Couples learned to scrutinize their own feelings and actions, constantly questioning whether their natural responses were sinful. The bedroom became a place of self-surveillance where every touch, every sensation, every moment of connection was filtered through layers of religious guilt and fear. But perhaps the most insidious bedroom rule was the doctrine of spiritual hierarchy, which taught that physical intimacy was acceptable only when it served the purpose of procreation, never for pleasure alone. This wasn't just a guideline, it was a fundamental principle that transformed the marriage bed into a breeding station where human connection was secondary to producing offspring for the church and state. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about the spiritual dangers of non-procreative intimacy. They taught that pleasure without the intention of conception was a form of adultery, even within marriage. Couples were expected to approach their most intimate moments with the cold calculation of farmers breeding livestock, focusing solely on the production of children while suppressing any feelings of joy, connection, or mutual satisfaction. The psychological damage inflicted by this doctrine was catastrophic. Imagine being told that expressing love for your spouse through physical intimacy was sinful unless you were actively trying to create a child. Picture the guilt and confusion of couples who found comfort and connection in each other's arms, only to be told by religious authorities that such feelings were evidence of spiritual corruption. The enforcement of procreation-only intimacy created marriages that were functional rather than loving, business partnerships rather than romantic unions. Women became vessels for child production, valued primarily for their fertility rather than their personalities, intellects, or emotional contributions to the relationship. Men were reduced to biological functions, expected to perform their reproductive duties without emotional investment or personal satisfaction. Medieval society also imposed the terrifying practice of fertility monitoring, where couples' private lives were subject to community scrutiny based on their reproductive output. Marriages that failed to produce children within the first year were considered suspect, potentially evidence of spiritual failure or hidden sins that prevented divine blessing. The pressure to demonstrate fertility transformed the bedroom into a performance space where couples' worth was measured by their biological productivity. Women who failed to conceive quickly enough faced accusations of barrenness, spiritual contamination, or secret sins that prevented pregnancy. Men whose wives remained childless were questioned about their own spiritual worthiness and physical capabilities. This fertility obsession created a culture where miscarriage, infant mortality, and natural variations in reproductive timing became sources of shame and social isolation. Couples dealing with the normal challenges of human reproduction found themselves branded as spiritual failures, their private grief transformed into public humiliation. The medieval church also enforced the doctrine of sexual seasons, which dictated that even permitted intimacy should follow agricultural patterns, with certain times of year considered more spiritually appropriate for conception than others. Spring was favored because children born in winter would have the best chance of survival. Summer was discouraged because pregnancy during harvest time would interfere with women's agricultural duties. These seasonal restrictions added another layer of artificial control over the most natural human instincts. Couples found themselves consulting calendars and almanacs before expressing physical affection, turning spontaneous moments of connection into calculated decisions based on farming schedules and religious doctrine. The bedroom rules extended even to sleeping arrangements, with elaborate regulations about how married couples should position themselves during rest. Separate beds were often required during forbidden periods, with detailed instructions about proper distances and barriers to prevent accidental contact. Some regions mandated that couples sleep with a wooden board or bundling board between them during restricted times. These physical separations created an atmosphere of constant vigilance and artificial distance between spouses who should have found comfort in each other's presence. The marriage bed became a negotiated space rather than a sanctuary, with invisible boundaries that shifted according to religious calendars and social expectations. Medieval authorities also imposed the practice of bedroom inspection, where local officials or religious representatives could demand access to married couples' private chambers to ensure compliance with various regulations. These inspections weren't limited to nobility or suspected transgressors. They were routine invasions of privacy that reinforced the state's and church's authority over the most intimate aspects of human relationships. The psychological toll of living under constant potential surveillance cannot be overstated. Modern couples struggling with intimacy issues often cite performance anxiety as a major obstacle to connection. Imagine that anxiety multiplied by the knowledge that religious and civil authorities could literally inspect your private moments for compliance with arbitrary rules designed by celibate theologians who viewed human sexuality as inherently corrupt. As you lie back in that cold stone chamber, the year still 1387, you can finally understand why the medieval marriage bed was indeed more dangerous than any battlefield. The wounds inflicted here weren't made by sword or arrow, but by the systematic destruction of human connection through religious control, social surveillance, and the transformation of love into legal obligation. These weren't just ancient curiosities or quaint historical footnotes. These were deliberate policies that turned the most intimate human relationships into instruments of state and church control. The conjugal debt that eliminated consent, the calendar of forbidden days that reduced couples to religious schedules, the purity laws that made women fear their own bodies, the bedding ceremonies that destroyed privacy, the confessional interrogations that weaponized guilt. Each rule was designed not to strengthen marriages, but to ensure that even in their most private moments, medieval people remained subjects first and lovers second. The medieval bedroom wasn't destroyed by ignorance or primitive understanding. It was systematically dismantled by authorities who understood exactly how powerful human connection could be, and who feared that power enough to regulate it into extinction. The tragedy isn't just what these couples endured, but what we lost as a civilization when we allowed institutions to invade the one space that should have remained sacred to human love itself. Tonight, as you return to your own bedroom, free from calendars of forbidden days and threats of spiritual examination, remember the price that countless medieval couples paid for the freedoms we now take for granted. Their suffering in those cold stone chambers bought us the right to love without fear, to connect without surveillance, and to find in each other's arms the sanctuary that medieval authorities worked so hard to destroy.